And finally, coming to Rushanara, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon. I'm going to go back to competitiveness, and I wanted to pick up on Lord Hill's remarks about needing to rethink the role of competitiveness. And obviously, we can see from the Brexit deal, the financial services got a pretty raw deal, and there are concerns about fragmentation and competition from the EU now. Can you just be very specific about whether you think that we now need to build in competitiveness within the framework for regulators? And I'd also be grateful if other witnesses, Dr. Swinburne and Baroness Bowles, if you could sort of set out yes or no, in more precise terms, because we've got skirted around this, but it'd be helpful to get a steer.
So from my point of view, as I said before, I haven't thought enough, and I don't know whether competitiveness is precisely the right word, but do I think you should have, in the overall terms of reference for regulators, the ability as part of a discussion to be able to come back to them and say, have you properly taken into account the effect of what you're doing on the broader economy? Yes, I think you should. So I think if you only have requirements to do with stability and risk reduction, particularly if powers are increasingly, if it turns out as part of this review, powers move from the Treasury to the regulators, you risk ending up with a system where there perhaps are not many checks and balances, and where elected people don't really have many levers to operate, given that a regulatory decision can have, so capital buffers, whatever it might be, has a massive impact on how much money a bank might be able to invest in a regional economy. So I think you want to make sure you've got, as we take responsibility for this stuff now, we don't construct a system where all of that is outsourced to a group of unelected people.
And just on this for you, do you think that there is a risk, however, given the financial crisis, that there is a risk that some in Parliament, I recognise what you're saying, that we need to frame this correctly, some in Parliament, in the rush to try and rebalance some of the potential losses, we're already seeing that because of the Brexit trade agreement, that there'll be a rush to increase competitiveness, build in competitiveness, and forget some of the important lessons from the FSA experience of light touch regulation that has been references made to that. And that we end up creating more problems for the future. That how do we, for all of you, how do we avoid repeating history while recognizing the new context and need for a new kind of business model in the new post-Brexit context?
You want me to go first, or the others have a go?
And then I'm gonna stop asking you questions.
Yeah. No, look, it's an extremely good question, and that the fact that these things aren't fixed and that they change over time adds to part of the definitional problem. But I think so. Reassurance one: if you want to be a global financial centre, which I assume we do, you're going to have to be consistent with, broadly speaking, with global standards and have a reputation for being a well-regulated system, because otherwise global capital isn't going to want to come there. But I think the answer to your question, and it's one of the recurring themes throughout here, is that if you need to be able to discuss these issues. I think you can't create a secret regulatory garden, whichever way around it is. So I think if you put in place a framework that sets a high level, and then some of these things we've been talking about, how do you get your regulators in? How do you try and make it more constructive? How do you keep it under review constantly? How do you involve the industry? That if you keep working at that, and politicians, whatever their views, have the ability to keep checking and asking and challenging and balancing, I think you're more likely to end up in a place that, we won't get everything right, I'm sure, but you've at least got a balanced approach. I think you don't want to outsource these really important decisions to people who, over whom our elected representatives have no influence.
Dr. Swinburne.
So I think there are two things here. I mean, having recently led a report on the UK competitiveness in financial services for the City UK, which has now ended up with HMT, that report was very much about what type of actions can the UK take in terms of its primary legislation and in terms of its future strategy and objectives, can it take in order to improve its global competitiveness? And, outside of the EU, what might it want to do? And none of that report is about deregulating. It's all about smarter regulation. It's about how can you make things more fit for purpose and have a proportionate regime that allows the global financial centre to really excel, but not the global financial centre excelling just in today's world and today's environment, but how do you set it up for the future digital capital market and the future world it needs to operate in competitively against everywhere else in the world. And regulators, by their very nature, tend to be fairly conservative with a little c. They tend to be, they have one eye to stability always as a primary objective. So if you want them to have an innovative agenda where they have to actually look to that future, I think they have to have an objective given to them that allows them to have some flexibility in how they approach this. But there is a competition objective within the PRA and the FCA at the moment. Both of them have got a secondary objective where they have to facilitate either competition between firms or indeed the FCA have to promote competition in the interests of consumers. So there's a competition but not a competitiveness one. I would suggest that for me, having looked at the competitiveness agenda recently for the industry, I would suggest that the overarching policies and objectives set by government and parliament should be where that eye to competitiveness is. Nothing that they should put in there, therefore, should force the regulator, but the regulator also shouldn't put blocks up. I mean, I think Sharon referred to earlier where they don't necessarily use all of their perimeter at this current point in time. You need to make sure through oversight, like by your committee and others, that they actually, if they are given scope to utilize some flexibility, they should be utilizing it to the full. So I think I wouldn't give them a direct competitiveness objective, but I would set the policies overall in such a way that they are in that framework and that they then are actually overseen to make sure that they use them to max flexibility. And it's not about deregulation, it has to be about smarter regulation.
Baroness Bowles.
Yes, I mean, I don't know why people think competitiveness is always going to mean deregulation. I know that that's not even what the FSA did. I mean, I think they just basically got an awful lot of things wrong. And they had this, yes, a deliberate light touch regime, which was at the heart of it. But I mean, if you don't know where your biggest industry is as a country, you're in a little bit of a trouble. So obviously you've got to look at things where if other countries are taking business from you and why, to address that, but I'd say in positive ways. And I mean, if you're looking at competition more broadly, I mean, there's nothing wrong with legislation laying out in more detail the various different aspects of it. You've got for consumers and pricing and for choice, you've got the development and encouragement of new products and industry. You have got the benchmarking of where we are and what you could do if things aren't going as what one would like, the whole productivity issues. What is the impact of change over stability, and above all, what's your reputation for good governance? Because I think that if you want to be a global leader in financial services, then good governance has to be at the heart of it. Yes, you're going to say, right, we're going to be outward looking, which exposes you to more competition, but that means you have to, sharpen your practices in the good sense of the word, not the sharp patch practice sense of the word. And so I don't think we should run away from this, but I don't think it would be sensible to just put it in such stark terms as that was there for the FSA.
Oh, thank you. That's really helpful. But I think you can appreciate that some of our memories are pretty, immediate in terms of the impact, as you pointed out, of the financial crisis, and then a decade of austerity that our constituents have had to bear. So it's a live discussion, and this is a moment to get it right, as you all have pointed out. I just wanted to turn you to a couple of other points. You talked about groupthink. With regulators, and also I think you'll appreciate over recent years with some of the big scandals, GRG, Lloyd's, the TSB technology failure case, a number of others, where the FCA, certainly on my watch while I've been on the committee, has had to give evidence, and where there's been a great deal of frustration that consumer interest, the public interest, is not high up on its agenda. And as all of you pointed out, it's not an easy job being a regulator. So how do we make sure that as we look at how these reforms happen, the FCA, as well as looking outwards internationally, is looking outwards into our regions, into the public and their interest in a genuine sense, because otherwise I think we're going to constantly run up against problems. And in relation to emerging issues, technology has been identified as a big emerging issue, and other areas that are unregulated are causing huge headaches for the British people. What are the things that need to be done in this review to address it? And how do we strengthen the scrutiny functions to make that happen?
Well, you strengthen the scrutiny functions first, and then a lot of other things follow from that, which means you have to have more powers, whether it's to intervene, to have access to data so you can check whether what you're being told is true or not, having the support of some independent office, whether it be the NAO or something else that can actually help you with some of the analysis of what is going on, checking that the perimeter hasn't been accidentally narrowed, maybe having some oversight of that and those definitions to make sure it's not just left with the regulators. You mentioned
fairness. Well, you mentioned the point about secretiveness, this is certainly a problem that Parliament's experienced. That Parliament's sovereignty of Parliament is under attack. Frankly, it has been in recent years, and some of us, certainly I'm in that category, feel less confident that we can get this right unless there's a willingness, particularly in Treasury and other government departments, to see the positives of building the scrutiny function, investing in resources. What would you say to our ministers about getting this, the importance of scrutiny, given the big task at hand for our country in relation to financial services regulation and what they need to do, because otherwise it's not going to happen?
Yeah. Well, I think you have to go back to the start and say, we've lost a lot of scrutiny. Whatever you may have thought of the EU system, there is no doubt that for those that wanted to bother to engage with it, there was a huge amount of transparency. And that was the backdrop to our legislation. It's the backdrop to FSMA 2000. And so what's wrong with this consultation is to say that going back to FSMA 2000, even the 2012 update, that was against the background of what we got from Europe as well. And it's very old-fashioned to be so lacking in transparency. And I just don't see how we can be a global leader unless we mend our ways. And it's as strong as that. If you want long-term success for the financial industry, without it just completely tearing to shreds what you care about in terms of social concern and other things, then the system has to be updated to give that power to the Parliament to do that useful scrutiny. This isn't about getting at governance. It's not about getting at regulators. It's actually about being a world leader.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great note to conclude on, unless others wanted to come in. Otherwise, I'm finished. I'm complete. Thank you.
Well, Rushanara, thank you very